Okay, we're going to make a start. Everyone will have to stay and help put the chairs away afterwards. First of all, I'm just going to find a spot to put this. Acknowledge all First Nations of this place we call Australia and recognise the many nations who have looked after country for more than 60,000 years. Curtin is honoured and grateful to have the privilege to maintain campuses operating in Boorloo here in Perth and Kalgoorlie in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. And I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present as custodians and owners of these lands. I recognise their deep knowledge and their cultural, spiritual and educational practices and aspire to learn and teach in partnership with them. I also acknowledge First Nations people connected to Curtin's global campuses. Here at Curtin, we're committed to working in partnership with custodians and owners to strengthen and embed First Nations voices and perspectives in our decision making now and into the future. So good afternoon everyone, Kaya. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Peter Ashworth and I'm the Director of the Institute for Energy Transition here at Curtin University. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you. If in the case of an emergency we do have to follow out and then take the stairs, there's only one set of stairs all the way down, but I would just say follow me, but it's very unlikely. And the bathrooms are located just outside to the elevators. But it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to Sharan Burrow, who is our Advisory Board Chair. And we've had a fantastic meeting with members of the Advisory Board today. And I think it's a really important intersection between academia, industry and government to be able to keep us on the straight and narrow when we're moving forward, and also for the inspiration to make sure the research we do is relevant. And so it's really fabulous to have Sharan. Sharan is a global advocate for human rights, climate action and just transition. She's the former General Secretary, she's telling me not to say anything, of the International Trade Union Confederation, and previously she was President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions and President of the Australian Education Union. And I've been a fan of Sharan's for many years, so it's a really great pleasure to be working with her. She's well known for her international advocacy on employment, human rights, industrial relations, corporate responsibility and climate action with green industrialisation and just transition solutions. There's so much more to Sharan, but she doesn't want me to read it out because of course she's very humble. But I think, there's no one better to talk about the role of people for a just transition and how we can harness that. So Sharan will talk for the next little bit, and then we do have the opportunity for Slido, which Ellen has asked me to put up there, and I'll be monitoring that at the end. So please welcome Sharan, and to everyone online, welcome as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to indeed those in the room and those online who I can't see. And maybe, oh good, we got rid of that photo. Let me also acknowledge the traditional owners and acknowledge that we are on Whadjuk land, but that indeed the campuses, but our work right across Australia and indeed around the world span many First Nations peoples. And we are still learning how to be respectful of First Nations rights and indeed co-ownership, if not indeed first ownership. So this is called Human Rights and the Energy Transition, but I'm going to put a subtitle in that says, are we prepared for a new generation of social licence? Are we prepared to jointly or design or co-create the future? Because if we're not, if people and planet aren't at the heart of our economic model, then the world's going to be a very, very divided place. We already see the damage done with geopolitics, the lack of trust, the challenges that we face in our democracies, indeed the decline of democracy, I would argue, because of a lack of trust. And we have a chance now to rebuild it, but we have to recognise that in fact historically transitions have not benefited everyone. Indeed, many have destroyed livelihoods for the majority, leaving stranded workers and communities, and too often environmental damage, even today, that's still in need of repair. In summary, rights and responsibility for workers and communities was simply seen as external to corporate responsibility. This reality and the associated poverty or displacement has over time eroded trust, which has only been multiplied by the extreme levels of inequality. If you read anything this year, read Michael Turgeon's book. He's a mathematician. I'm not a mathematician, but he has actually gone in and analysed periods of great conflict and decline in our societies. And it shows when inequality becomes so vast, then it's not even the disaffection of people that causes decline, but in fact the competition for the majority and the declining nature then of wealth as it's divided and divided and divided between those who have and those who do not. So, and of course, as we started, for Indigenous peoples, all too often, they have warned that the extraction of wealth from their lands, the lack of shared prosperity, and is actually damaging their traditional way of life. But they've also borne the brunt of, they've attracted none of the benefits or very little of them, and they've been left with the environmental scars and borne the brunt of having to repair their traditional lands. This is a bleak picture, but it has been our picture of economic development, despite all of the things that have generated vast wealth. We've grown GDP, depends on the nation you're in, 4, 6, 7, 10 times in the last 40 years. But we've failed to share prosperity, and we've all too often failed to include people, particularly First Nations people, but people everywhere. However, in 2015, then there was hope when governments actually seemed to understand the warnings that many people, including the union movement, had put out through the OECD, through the UN, at the height of the 2008-09 financial crisis, that trust was broken and that inequality was becoming a global risk. The OECD particularly bore this out with research, but it wasn't until 2015 we saw a glimmer of hope when governments understood the risk to people, planet and prosperity, as world leaders committed to both the Sustainable Development Goals and to the Paris Climate Agreement. It could be characterised as a moment where there was a promise of a zero poverty, zero carbon world. Sadly, far from being realised. It did, however, generate a swell of renewed interest in ESG, which is the investors' terminology and corporate terminology, and of course, with a focus on the E and the S, environment and social. There were, of course, governance standards and, already in the making, and they were beefed up, but particularly we saw a chance to actually build on the responsibility elements of environment and, of course, of rights and people. We have mixed results from that, because despite many progressive corporate leaders and or government intervention, we still saw too many workers between 2015 and 2024, too many workers and their communities simply stranded because of extremes of climate, the transition. When you talk about people losing lives and livelihoods, already being on the front line of climate, of extreme weather events and climate change and being displaced, we don't recognise a lot of it because to date the displacement is largely internal in already very crowded countries. But my nightmare used to be Bangladesh. I used to talk to my former staff about welcome to my nightmares. And one of them was what happens when Bangladesh, which is a low-lying landmass with 30 million people just above sea level, and there is no room. It's a crowded country, arable lands at a, peak, etc. And it wasn't Bangladesh, it was actually Pakistan when those massive floods roared through Pakistan, but same territory, and there are many low-lying countries in our region as well as the rest of the world, not to mention our Pacific Islands, which are becoming atolls in many cases at best. But despite all of that work, and there were commissions, I sat on them, there was, we started to see standards developed, we saw all sorts of activity, but we still didn't see it being implemented to support people and include people at the heart. And consequently, the fear of change, when added to a lack of trust, due to failed promises of past interventions, results in a lack of social licence from the very communities that the energy and industrial transitions of today rely on. We can't do this without largely regional communities. There are things you can do in cities, but you cannot indeed provide the energy mix, the critical minerals, the manufacturing supply chains, whatever it is in terms of upstream and downstream processing and production. It largely relies on our regions. Cities can play a role, and particularly their catalytic impact in terms of procurement standards to actually generate a lot of the shifts, but we rely on those regional communities. And if the trust is broken, then why are we surprised that there's a lack of social licence from those very communities? There are any number of examples, but none more exploitative than the child labour or modern slavery of the critical minerals industry. Doesn't stop with the critical minerals industry, but if you've walked those mining territories in the DRC or Myanmar or parts of Africa or other parts of China and India like I have, then you know that this is not something you would want your children or your family members engaged in, and yet other people's children and family members are in fact exploited, damaged, often indeed maimed or indeed lose their lives to provide for our needs. As much as we need those minerals or we need the manufacturing, if it's in those exploitative conditions or even in manufacturing in the sweatshops through supply chains, then we can't actually say we're making a just and equitable transition. Even closer to home, the continued failure to recognise Indigenous people as the landowners and thus equity partners in any development. Not only do they have the first and last say about their lands and what should be developed on them, it is unbelievable that we actually continue to think that it's transactional, that you can simply pay a rent for land at best, leave some jobs, maybe some skills, but that is changing, but not fast enough. And certainly when you look at some of the best and worst of the cases around the world, as well as here, there is a long way to go, but we can learn the lessons of the past. And notwithstanding industrial laws and anti-discrimination law in Australia, we still have no legal charter of human rights, one of the only countries in the world not to have a human rights charter. And indeed, the notion of mandated due diligence, which based on the UN guiding principles for business and human rights that has been passed in Europe, doesn't even get discussed here beyond the anti-slavery laws, and they're not very, their scope and compliance isn't very deep or very strong. So we have a long way to go. And even though this seems like a very long fight globally to get the S in ESG and to get the standards, it's now more critical than ever. I would argue that the S in ESG is vital to ensure trust and a new generation of social licence. Yet the S has largely been superficial, and as I said, outside of Europe excludes rights in almost everywhere supply chains. The due diligence mandates are really important, but not if they're not actually widespread, universal, and implemented as part of the business planning. So we do need to shift from a landscape where voluntary corporate social responsibility was indeed an issue respected by some companies to rights that are respected by others, with a scope and compliance that people can trust. Global commitments to just transitions were then established in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. I must tell you that while we celebrated long and hard that night, the next day I woke up with another nightmare, because having got it in the preamble of the Paris Climate Agreement, the shock horror was, oh my God, now we have to implement it. How the hell do we do that? And where do you start? Lots of things we could talk about there, because we're still in the process of that. But while the preamble commitment to just transition, the words refer to jobs and decent work, or the workforce generally. But when it's combined with the commitment that we also fought with rights groups and community groups and progressive business to get in the preamble, then obviously the interpretation is much broader and includes other vulnerable communities, and so it should. These obligations were reaffirmed at COP28 last year, when governments actually agreed to submit just transition plans. Let's see. A lot of activity going on around this, not the depth that we would all want. But there is a growing body of cases that actually give you hope, and yet the deep consultative practices or joint planning required to drive trust is rarely built into the business model. You will see it sit alongside, often, progressive business, but a lot of the reporting is still outsourced. We have more than $100 billion invested in auditing every year. Some of that's legitimate, but it's not legitimate if businesses are simply saying, look, we've done all these good things, give us a nice, pretty report. Unless it's embedded in the business model, we're again going to fail. And social licence has traditionally been transactional or benevolent in nature. And even now you see, all too often, massive projects that are fantastic in opportunity, but you'll get the architectural specs, you'll get the finance, you'll get the government permitting on the way, and then you'll go to a community with this huge volume of documents and you'll say, look, page 1627, there's actually a co-benefits arrangement, you'll be really well off. And they wonder why communities give them a proverbial finger. No one's stronger about this outside of trade union movement and community groups than Peter Ashworth, sitting right here, who's frankly could give this discussion because she's had such a long history of this. But even where there are promises of investment, jobs and justice, these are slow to be realised. And again, that erodes that trust. Even where there is government commitments, investors or corporations actually still face the reality of the lack of inclusion or accountability that actually simply promotes fear and resentment in the communities, often through no fault of their own. Just a whole range of bureaucratic nightmares where if the business model isn't fit for purpose and the government support isn't fit for purpose and people aren't at the heart of it, then you are going to risk failure, and that just breeds further distrust. Thus, the current challenge for a rapid whole-of-economy shift in energy, technology, the use of environment or repair of nature requires a new generation of social licence, with just transitions being the solution, but it has to be based on trust that includes respect for human rights and labour rights, with the inclusion of deep consultative processes required for transitions for workers and communities. Trust will effectively be established and an inclusive economy assured if all parties agree to co-create the future. Then you have agency and you have people who are committed and take responsibility for actually being part of a future for themselves, their children and their grandchildren. There are progressive business examples, but standards and disclosure requirements do not include specific reporting on social impact. The TCFD and now the TNFD, so climate and nature disclosures, provides frameworks for disclosure, but indeed, while these are problematic in terms of implementation because of the complexity, the TSFD, or the TSIFD as it's currently called, is not yet in development. Soon, but not yet in development. The ISSB has a consultation, which is the global standards body, and of course we've got all the interoperability challenges with Europe and other standards, but nevertheless, it has a paper out, a consultation paper out on human capital, but human and labour rights are not part of the scope at this point. Can't blame Emmanuel Faber for that, but he's got a board and he's got a whole lot of pressures, and so we have to do something about breaking that open. No one can deny that we have a skills crisis and that a commitment to skills and reskilling is an essential component of just transitions, both for the industrial transition but also for technologies. I was saying today that AI, if you take our workforce, about 3.3 million people will have their jobs augmented by AI. Many are now, but there's about 3.9 or 7 to 9 million, I can't do the sums in my head, that actually will have many of their skills undertaken by AI. And so the upskilling challenge for all of these areas of transition is really vital and must be associated with just transition processes. And emerging principles in standards and reporting actually talk about doing no harm, or worse, doing no significant harm. Now, for justice communities, they would say where the harm's already deep and embedded and the scars and the mistrust is there, simply to have that as a baseline is actually not going to build that confidence. So we need to think about how to define that. People who've put that in have been of goodwill, but do no harm against what? What's the baseline? What's the benchmark? How do people have a say in what doing no harm means? And so we go again around the challenge despite the good intent. As I've said, we need to embed it in business practices. And I had the opportunity to talk to 30 CEOs in Evian, a beautiful part of the world, in June, and it was a nice relief from the Australian winter. But in fact, I was co-presenting with the CEO of the Michelin Group. Now, I'm going to admit to my ignorance because I did a bit of research on them and I was really surprised. I always think of Michelin as tyres to restaurants, you know, pretty interesting kind of supply chain, but nevertheless. But in fact, their business plan is so much more diversified, including now things like hydrogen fuel cells, recycling, a whole range of things. And Florent Menegaux, who is the CEO, was a really impressive presenter about both the ambition and the challenge. So the value set that he drives into the company, but the executive go along with him, but also the challenges. But when you look at their website, it states that the facts speak for themselves. Humanity and all life on Earth are in danger, and in the face of threats facing the planet, is convinced that a sustainable future cannot be imagined without a growth model that takes planetary limits into consideration based on real societal and social responsibility. The CEO himself has publicly expressed the view that no development project can be imagined without considering all its economic, social and environmental impacts. Similarly, no single player can meet the collective challenges facing the world. This is actually a call for collaboration, not just within companies, but across companies, and across companies, communities and government, as well as investors, to say, can we imagine a world that puts people and planet, so people, climate, nature, at the heart of our economic model? I can tell you, and I won't take up time, there are a number of people that would stand up and stand alongside Florent, but there's not enough of them. And some of the progressive business leaders in the US right now are under such attack, incredible attack, even where they're doing really brave things like electrifying even Harley Davidson. A friend of mine runs the company, and he's under severe attack because it's in the south of the US for being committed to climate, to electrification and so on. But there is courageous men and women out there who will stay the distance, and let's hope the US elections provides us some comfort in a few months' time. But nevertheless, we know that we all have to support courage and commitment and inclusion in ways we've never really thought about as deeply before. So the challenge is, can we include people in the development of every project? Can rights and inclusion be built into the business model? Can we also see a shift to collaboration or people-based development, which requires a level of codependence that challenges current competition policy? And I must say I'm very proud of Australian companies through the B Team Australia who did the first Scope 3 report that actually was a world first, but they had to get round competition policy so they could share data. And now those 7 industries are actually working together to try and implement it. And Scope 3 is still something that is not on most people's radar. But if we want to be seen as a clean export country, if our young people want to be proud of our production, wherever it is, in whatever form it is, then we need to tackle not just Scope 1 and 2, but Scope 3, and it will take that kind of collaboration, just as the social aspects and place-based development will take that. With the current challenge, of course, for a rapid whole-of-economy shift in energy technologies, green industrialisation, it does aggregate to nothing short of an industrial revolution. That's pretty exciting, really. But when you put it alongside the challenges of the use or the pricing in of externalities, not just emissions, but indeed natural services that we've taken for granted, and or repair of nature, vital for all business to continue to function, then it can't be done without embracing a new generation of social licence. It's uncomfortable. We're going to have to be made to feel uncomfortable, and it's not just uncomfortable for companies, it's uncomfortable for people too, because agency means responsibility. And so you have to be part of both the planning and the implementation. Not always an easy thing. It's easier to stay outside and throw rocks. We'll have to do a bit of that still, even as we play on the inside as well, because this transition is not going to be easy, and it's generational. So for all the young people in the room, we have to stand near you and actually support you to imagine that future. And that's not always something that people readily understand at all. So this much deeper approach does put people in the planning process in a manner based on trust and inclusion, and it's hard. But the respect for human rights and the consultative processes required for just transitions for both workers and communities has to be internalised in terms of the way we do business. It's that simple. So the extractive model that has actually been our trade model, where we've largely exploited low wage, resources, etc., of communities in the south for production to markets in the north, has to shift. And we need a much deeper partnership approach to trade. So not only is the global trade model not fit for purpose, needs reform, needs to allow deep partnerships with almost the corporate offtake agreements that leave investment, skills and production capacity in the countries that are partnered, but it will require us to think about how we share our IP, not just technology, but our skills development. If we're talking about skills pathways, we can no longer simply, again, extract skills through migrant workers as much as we desperately need migrant workers, and will continue to, without thinking about what it means to leave skills in the countries that are our partnerships. So all of this leads me to say that unless this is, we can't have just superficial complexity. We need transparency, and we need to take the risk that might mean we fail a little along the way, but we actually pick ourselves up and together build the outcomes that will, based on that trust, will generate success. We desperately actually need to think about all the projects as in terms of, are we building democratic legitimacy? When our democracies are at risk, when the trust is really not there, how do we actually build from the ground up democratic legitimacy that enables governments then to say, this is what our communities want, this is how we can support that shift, and likewise support our companies, our unions, our civil society organisations, and what they want to do. It's really interesting that, for me, that some companies who've had a long history of fighting all of these measures, not wanting trade unions, not wanting to take on externalities that might involve social responsibility, ignoring their environmental footprints. One such company, who I can openly admit has been a global nemesis for the trade union movement. I've stood on many stop work meetings around Vale, which is a huge mining company out of Brazil, and indeed they ignored, that BHP was actually invested in the dam that collapsed and so on, but they ignored the call from the building unions up to 6 years before that collapse about safety, because it would have hurt their bottom line. And we know the history. But can I tell you, engagement with people is always really critical. And there's a fantastic miner who's actually now brave enough to take on the chair of Vale, and their CEO, CFO, the executive team are trying to shift to a human rights platform. And the 2IC told me just a few weeks ago, actually in Rome, that they'd done an assessment of their footprint where Vale's major operations were around the world. And they were shocked to find that 2 million people, where not just a small operation here, but large footprints on which the community depended, 2 million people in those communities live below the poverty line. Now, some of us wouldn't have been surprised, but the good news story about that is that they're doing it, that they're actually taking responsibility. The next steps then are, how do you engage community to actually make a difference in that context? So I would say that if we have to, in terms to get to net zero, if we have to renovate or reform, whatever it is, drive new change in both upstream and downstream processing and production, or we won't meet the challenge, then we have to equally recognise that if we don't involve our communities with agency, then we won't indeed get there at the scale and speed. The best chance is place-based development, and it's the best chance we've had for place-based development in generations. When you can co-locate other industries with renewable energy, with industrialisation and the spin-offs, and we've seen it in places like the north of Sweden, where clean steel and a renewable energy source was the basis for then what is now a vibrant community in what was previously a tiny little community of Boden, then we know it's possible. And you see it in many other places as well. However, I have to say that while we argue that collaborative partnerships in planning and development are essential, the state of play is not that encouraging. I work, and many of you in the room. I know, Rochelle, Catherine, Peter and Owen and others work with progressive business to try and get the job done. Sometimes we work and engage with people we want to bring along the journey, and we have to do that. But if you look at the World Benchmarking Alliance, it'll show you just how far we have to go. On 6 indicators, social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, and we're just talking dialogue here, not the deep co-creation processes I'm talking about, planning for a just transition, green and decent job creation, retaining and reskilling and or upskilling a workforce, social protection and social impact management, and advocacy for policies and regulation on just transition. The key findings are pretty dismal. Only 5% receive more than a mid-level score, 5% of companies, and indeed I think it was across 180 ASX 200 companies. Just 2 out of 180 meet all 4 elements of just transition planning. 23% only of companies publicly committed to reskilling or upskilling displaced workers, and redeployment was not guaranteed. Only 4% of the companies demonstrated advocacy for just transition policies and regulations, and only 12 out of 180 demonstrated the basics of human rights due diligence. All that tells me is we have work to do. All of us, we have work to do. And closer to home, we know that the national effort to rapidly decarbonise Australia's energy network is the greatest macroeconomic challenge of our generation. We also know that, as I said, regional Australia will carry responsibility for anchoring this transition, hosting the major renewables infrastructure, but also our processing and production from critical minerals through to manufacturing. And if we can't rely on global supply chains for a whole range of reasons, we have to learn again how to make things in Australia so that we can have a whole, and of course a future made in Australia. The federal government's policy gives us a framework for some of that. Doesn't mean there won't be trade, doesn't mean there won't be partnerships, but we have to change our economy. The South Australian Premier, when I listened to him a few weeks ago, and Owen, you were there, I think, at the ACTU conference, put up 3, you wouldn't call them graphs actually, I don't know what they were. They were very complex pictures, but they were from an OECD report, and it showed Germany, and green was the complexity of the economy, the diversification, the manufacturing base, and orange was the sort of primary production that you didn't value add. Very little orange. Put up Canada, half and half. Put up Australia, green was actually very, very tiny. It was, at first everyone went, what's that? By the time he got through the 3 slides, his message was very clear. We have to go from that orange picture to that green, and with some relative orange underpinnings that Germany has indeed managed. Not without challenge today, but nevertheless the complexity of our economy. And I want to end by talking about a recent report, because it says everything that any of us could, and the work that Peter and the Energy Institute are doing here at Curtin, the Energy Transition Institute are doing here at Curtin, crosses the field. Yes, it's about technology. Yes, it's about research and applied research and learnings, but it's also about the social fabric that makes all that possible. And when you look at a report that was done just in July this year, based on regional polling, sadly not in WA, we'll fix that, Peter, won't we? But that the social licence for these developments is indeed highly contested. When you've got a combination of factors undermining the sport, including lack of government engagement and coordination, and Peter and I were talking today about regions who are critical, who haven't seen government representatives from any level. They need a roadmap to a renewable energy system. They don't see a common roadmap. There's a low trust, as I've said, in government and many companies who've made promises but not realised them. A fragmented public discussion, susceptible to misinformation. We totally understand that, and part of our discussion today is how you lift that education base. Legitimate concerns about the impact of major developments on nature, and thus the communication strategy. Before you can start actually putting the projects in place, the communication strategy to improve trust in regions for the shift to renewables and other associated industries must be through an active program of community education, engagement and empowerment. So just as you hear repeatedly from Peter Ashworth, and if you hang around with Peter long enough, kind of gets into your head, that it proposes a replicable community-led process that seeks to not just secure consent for development, but build long-term trust. And that means we have to shift the perspective from them to us. So that agency where communities feel like they have some power has to be established. We have to build understanding of the energy transition with show, don't tell, show people. You have to fight rumour with humour because people now get all sorts of information sources, and where we're simply telling them that that's ridiculous, that's wrong, that they have the wrong information, I could be much more vocal about that, then that's not going to work. People want to feel the dignity of respect. So you have to actually use inclusive ways of actually saying, well, have you thought about or have you seen this research? You have to nurture local champions. All of us can go into other communities and help, but we can't be the advocates for the community. You have to stand alongside those people and support them. We have to speak to the lovers of nature. I still hear people dismissing conservationists. I hear it in many communities, like, they're just extremists. Well, actually, some of them are defenders of the natural environment we need to succeed. And so we have to find a way to talk to them, and yes, there'll be trade-offs, but we have to again give them agency over those trade-offs and the solutions for perhaps assuaging the worst of the scarring of our environment. But we, in reality, have to build a process that people can control or can have some control over. Communities need a reason to change, and honesty is the best place to start. We have promised communities a lot, and it hasn't been delivered over many decades when there's been shifts in the economy or shifts in politics or whatever it might be. But without a shared understanding of the imperative to move to net zero emissions, the transition story doesn't make sense to people. We need to be clear about the urgency of the transition, the need for the transition from fossil fuels to reach net zero at the outside by 2050. We need to make the case that transition is well underway, with 40% of the electricity already coming from renewables. And we need to establish that the world is moving away already from fossil fuels, and that Australia and their communities, our communities, will be left behind if we aren't, in fact, in the middle and out front, in some cases, in transition. Means we're not asking communities to lead, we're asking them not to get left behind. So giving them the choice about whether they want to be part of the future or not. So the challenge of just transitions or leaving no one behind, people cannot be left out of decisions that affect their future and their human and labour rights. Labour rights are human rights. They must be a baseline for action, and the agency and the power that people should have to co-create their future with our business leaders, with our government leaders, cannot be overlooked if we're to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. As always, very insightful. We do have Slido, so we're going to use that to make it fair for people online and offline. So if you wanted to, anyone in the room, ask a question. I'm just going to start off. I mean, colleagues of mine at CSR all those years ago developed a model for social license. And one of the things they used to talk about was this idea of, it really should be beyond compliance. But if we think about what you've described, and to me, it all makes sense. Why wouldn't you? Because it's good business sense. But we're actually seeing it's not really happening. Is it that we're going to need, how do we find that balance between, companies understanding or governments understanding that actually, or do we actually need regulations, as you talked about, to make this happen?
You need a mix. I mean, ultimately, there are some things you have to legislate for. But, social licence has been transactional, basically. If you think about what it means, it's whatever you had to do to not get opposition. And often that was individual transaction, so it's not that this isn't legitimate, but you pay for the land that you're renting or buying or whatever it might be to put your infrastructure on, or you invest in the local community to build local council to sponsor facilities, often subsidised by the state for new energy instalments, or indeed manufacturing infrastructure, whatever. But it's always been a promise, and the agreement's been at the margins and often by powerful individuals. And that we can see it all around the world. That is now being rejected, particularly by younger people, and particularly where it's not where it's not integrated. I'm actually, I love it, but I'm also provoked by young people in all sorts of places who say, well, we want to be involved, but frankly, if there's not a legislative frame, and they see often litigation, which has its place, but litigation, and you're starting to see rights ascribed to rivers and lakes and natural environments, and they think that that's got to be the case, or you're not got the baseline capacity for companies to see they have to change the business model. It's a mix, but every community will be different. Every community will have different aspirations, although they'll have some in common. So, yeah, it just is, we're in a situation where you can't take trust for granted, so you have to rebuild it.
I'm going to go to one here and it's around the urgency, because I also think Sustainable Development Goals, they're running out at 2030 and we're now at 2024 and we're still a long way if we looked at what we set out to. But this question says, given the urgency of your message, how do you maintain patience with graduate incremental change, and why do you choose to work in that space?
Oh, well, I don't know that I'm patient, but I have learnt that the fight for aggressive change is not always going to get the results you want. And frankly, I was telling the story this afternoon about Korea and Japan, who have a technology that they want to integrate green hydrogen, starting at 20%, getting to 50%, into coal-fired power stations. And I was confronted with what I might think about this at a recent forum in Singapore, and I went, I'd said, can I have a minute? And all going through my head is, hang on a tick, we've just got the world to realise we have to move on from coal. I've walked those coal-fired power stations and the coal mining communities and told them with absolute tears in my eyes, because of the proud communities they are, that the party's over. I have scars on my back. Why would we go backwards? And then the light goes on and I thought, you know what? There are new coal-fired power stations coming online in ways that we can't afford to have them online, in India, in China, in all sorts of places. And maybe, for those assets that are newer, rather than having, as Rochelle says, sweated their assets to the end of their life, then there is a chance to actually transition, to reduce emissions and to protect vulnerable workers in that transition, provided we actually have a baseline for the transition. And it's like the gas industry. There will be gas in our makeup, but you have to have an exit strategy and it has to be transparent, or otherwise we're going to go through the same pain for workers and communities at some point, might be just 15, 20 years down the track, if the demand curve in the 40s is going to go like that, it'll hasten it up, let's see. But we're going to go through the same pain without just transitions in place that we're going through now in terms of coal communities. So I did have a change of pace, and it just made me think, okay, Sharon, there's perhaps not just one way, but it does take a deep breath.
Can I ask you, you've talked about this before, but the role of democratic institutions and democracy, you know, when you read the reports, we're actually slipping back more and more. And if we look at geopolitics, I mean, what are your thoughts on how we exist?
I always think go back to community. I mean, maybe it comes from our background, but if you're going to organise, and remember the trade unions have a thing of anger, hope, action, and people are angry. They're not even so angry, they're just in despair, they're disaffected, you know, and there is in some communities anger spilling over. Look at France, look at the UK, look at some of the shocking kind of hatred in the US and other places, the politics of the Russia-Ukraine war, or Gaza and Palestine, dividing peoples who want peace. I mean, all of that. But, you know, the point is that when you go back to community and when you indicate that they can build a future for themselves, and you've got the power standing by them, whether it's governments or companies or investors, or even just I make the point, Peter, and it annoys me that we do need big companies, please. We need our big companies and we need decent work in supply chains. But you know what? We built banks. People tell me there's no money. We built the superannuation funds. We built building societies are now banks to my horror, but they're still mutuals. You know, we've built cooperatives. We actually know how to build community wealth. And so no solution is impossible if we've really got a mindset about what wants to happen. And I was telling people about, I just sit on the sidelines of this, but every so often the group that works with Rewiring Australia, led by Sol Griffiths, will call me up and say, can we have a coffee or a lunch or something? I'll say, yeah, sure. And they just want to test something because, you know, it's just like being a reflective mirror and you ask the hard questions. But they told me recently that when they put out the call for communities, because there's a community around Thurrool where Sol lives that is determined to be the first all-electric community in Australia. All electric. So think about what that means. Retrofitting, deals with suppliers, EVs, charging infrastructure, etc. When they put out the call to see if there are other communities, they got 50 overnight. Now, not all of them might make the grade, but there's power in community.
So on that, how can trust be built when there's such a pervasive culture of greenwashing that, if anything, is growing? Greenwashing that.
Greenwashing, disinformation, misinformation. I mean, again, I think we talked about it today in Peter's advisory committee, but we need an education base that actually engages people in not telling them where they're wrong, but in giving them an understanding and facts that get beyond that. And somewhere we do need, and it's a bit strange for me to say because I preach compliance, you know, with human rights violations and labour rights violations all around the world, but I also think that you have to give people a licence not to get it right immediately. And that means companies, means investors, it means us, you know, and so there is, again, it's based on trust. If you're going to fail, then failing together because you trust the people with you. Unless you can build that trust, we're not in the market.
I think that's very hard for governments, or I see that here in Australia at the moment, or just in general, it can be really hard.
But then if you go back to the community, and the community is absolutely determined, and you've got companies and investors standing alongside of you, and they're there, they mightn't be perfect, but they are there, then no politician's going to ignore the power of a community when they need their votes. So again, it is that collective capacity.
So this question, with no clear single roadmap, inadequate planning policy and low trust from community, what do you recommend renewable energy developers do to bridge this divide?
Well, I mean, I think I've said it all, really. I can tell you that there's one company, I won't name them, who, you know, we're just sitting around in a forum and someone said, can I have a cup of coffee? So what would you do about this? We've spent 220 million on planning and permitting and processes, but we can't get a social licence. 220 million, they couldn't get the permit. And at best it might take 5 years. Now, that might be okay for some very large companies. I don't think so, but that's crazy. So if you didn't have that commitment from the community first up, why would you invest all that money? And if you don't believe just that one company story, Systemic's done the figures, because I got really frustrated, and there's a great Australian woman who works for Systemic, forgive her for working for one of the you know, more conservative, although they're not so conservative, but, you know, advisory, or what do you call them, consultancy houses. But she did a figure that showed 2 years ago now that $100 billion of climate finance was at risk every year if you didn't get the consultative processes right. So if nothing else, if the power of, you know, risk of that kind of investment tells us we've got to do something different, then, you know.
So I'm just aware of time and things, but I think about that and your sort of, you know, your life examples of work and things. It's not like we haven't been there before. So what is the one thing that you would share around this place-based development in your mind, or one or two things if you think around all of your trips around the world to these different countries and workplaces? What are the things that could be done differently, say here in Australia, to pivot that and to really fast track?
We don't have enough examples, but we have examples of where it's working. And I think here in WA, your industry precincts give us a real chance. You know, if there's a focus on Kwinana, the Pilbara, other areas, other regions, and Owen's organised me to go and listen to people in Collie on Wednesday with Peter, and I'm really looking forward to that, because it is listening to people that's really important. And I think here, if you get those regions and people know, and the spin-off from those regions, because again, there'll be demands into other communities, there'll be city demands into, you know, if I'm going to be just a little bit political for a minute, then I understand there's a plan for 100 windmills near Collie. I'll get that corrected if I'm wrong, in the next couple of years. And within 2 years, once it's all established, you can power Perth Plus. Whereas there's a plan in another part of the political spectrum for a nuclear reactor a few kilometres away would provide less than a third of the same power and won't be built. If it's affordable, won't be built. And you get community licence, which I don't think you will, but if all of that's in place, won't be built before, they say 2035, I reckon it's probably, you know, 5 to 10 years minimum out from that. So what's the choice? But until we put that choice before people, then, you know, we're going to live with all the views, the disinformation, the lack of facts, but people have to be able to make that choice.
Okay. There are other questions, but I think I'm very aware you've had a very long day today. There are lots of communities out there in WA, I think, that are really keen to embrace this, and that's exciting, but also across Australia. So for everyone that came tonight, thank you very much. For those online, and please join me in thanking Sharan. She's had a great
Thank
day.
you for turning out. And good luck with the rest of the week, because it's a big week for WA. And I haven't got technical with you or anything else, but I think backing it in with the challenge to say, can we co-create a future? Can we implement a new generation of social licence with human rights is absolutely fundamental to the challenge, and it's your challenge. Thank you.